I'm Scott McDonald. I'm an associate professor in the College of Education. I'm also the director of the Krause Innovation Studio. And my TLT fellowship is around learning spaces. So specifically, thinking about how we know what learning spaces we want to use for what purposes, and what data is available for faculty and students when they're thinking about learning spaces, their choices of where they want to take or teach a class, and then how the university thinks about that on a sort of a broader scale. How do they think about learning spaces? How is space getting utilized? And how are we using space to sort of push teaching in interesting ways?
Great. So we'll stick with the learning spaces theme first, and then we'll back out into kind of the general fellows project stuff. So what are some of your frustrations with how learning spaces are, and you can pick which angle you want to take, how they're conceptualized and designed, how they're allocated, how they're used, take your pick where you want to start on that one.
Okay. Let's see. I guess, well, first of all, where do you start with that one? I think we have a notion that the people that should be making, and this is going to sound counterintuitive maybe, but the people that are making the decisions about what the learning spaces should look like, especially going forward, are the faculty that teach in there and the students that learn in there. And while I think those are voices that have to be at the table, I think the problem is those, broadly speaking, are conservative voices. So students don't like it when they arrive in a class and it's not meeting their expectations in terms of what they thought a class at Penn State is. And faculty are the same way. They sort of have a notion of what it means to teach a class. And if they come in and their room isn't set up for them to do it that way, it can be jarring. So I think we have to start thinking about how we can change learning spaces to push different kinds of teaching, at the same time recognizing that goes hand in hand with having to support faculty and students in making that sort of cultural shift for what does the new classroom look like and what are the expectations of me in this new environment. So I think, I guess if I was gonna say a big thing about learning spaces, it's that we don't really pay attention to them. I mean, we sort of take them for granted as, which is why, in the TLT talk that I did this year, it was called the Forgotten Technologies, learning spaces, the forgotten technology, because it is an incredibly important technology in learning that we almost entirely ignore. So I think that's, if there was a big frustration, it's that we put huge amounts of money into renovating these spaces and designing these buildings, and I don't know how much thought goes into the learning.
Mm-hmm. What sort of, as you mentioned, kind of the renovations and things like that, it made me think of computers, and whenever we're here in our office, we have like a refresh cycle of 3 years, right?
Right.
Do spaces have the same kind of thing? Is there a
That's an interesting
is there
question.
a refresh rate for a learning space, and how quickly do you think innovations or things come about that kind of would call for thinking about this on a regular basis?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I've not thought about that but it makes a hell of a lot of sense. If you're going to talk about it as, technology, space is a technology, then what's the refresh rate on that technology? I mean, my gut instinct is that there should be. I think there is. I mean, Penn State renovates its classrooms, but those tend to be aesthetic refreshes, right? I mean, maybe they add some technology into the space, and that's a legitimate refresh, if they're adding projectors or if they're adding a podium and with, sort of multimedia pieces to it. And that stuff gets refreshed, but the space itself, I think the tricky thing about the space is you can do the aesthetic piece, but then there's the walls of the space, right? I mean, that are a real limitation. So I think probably the refresh rate is slower, but the refresh that happens has to be driven by different choices rather than just, with technology, it tends to be the technology no longer supports the software we need it to support, for example, right? So we have to replace the hardware because the software is so much more advanced and our hardware's getting slow, or it's not compliant with certain rules or regulations or systems that we have in the infrastructure, so we have to upgrade the technology, but those things don't really apply in the same way to the space.
Mm-hmm. So thinking back on learning spaces, for a long time the chalkboard was disruptive, right? People
Right.
were,
Sure.
what do? We're turning our back.
That's right.
And then, we have whiteboards, we have projectors, you could argue for better or worse. What do you think's on the horizon that might make a really big impact to kind of the formal spaces in our college classrooms?
Yeah, I think the thing that we've got to grapple with that's related to that is what are we going to do about sort of large lectures, and in particular, how might mobile devices impact that? You know, if we start thinking about lectures as a distributed environment, right, that could be distributed over a mobile platform. So, you know, some people might be in the classroom, some people might be in another room where they're meeting together, but they're all watching it together. Some people are at home, or in small groups, sort of wherever they want to be, in the coffee shop, getting together. I think that's, in terms of space, I think that's one of the big things that we're going to be having to think about in the future. Because I think this idea of a large lecture is I think we all know on some level that it's unsustainable. We just don't know when it's going to actually become unsustainable, and what the replacement for it will be. So I think that's a big one.
It makes me think of, so Central Florida, and they have, people call it under construction forever. So I guess they're just growing at such a rate, they just don't have physical spaces for housing, for teaching and things like that.
Right.
So they've gone down the path, at least from what I understand, where they're offering, they're enrolling 2,000 kids in class that is assigned a room with 500 seats in it. And their thought is, if you want to participate live in the room, you show up early and
get
claim
a
a
seat.
seat. If not, they have live streaming, so you can participate synchronously, and they have support staff, probably like TAs that
Sure.
monitor what's going on in the synchronous environment. Or if you want to watch it captured that night or the next day, you have the ability to do that.
Yeah.
Now it kind of cracks me up because from what I understand, there's no intentionality that was a model they wanted to get to. It was a
Right.
force of a force of nature. They just had to do something.
Sure.
But I could see something like that, when done intentionally, you could do some really interesting things with.
Yeah, well, it makes you think about what is going to force Penn State's hand
Mm-hmm.
in that game. But yeah, that's interesting, because that is often the way universities make big change, or any big organization makes big change, is when they have no other choice, right? They're forced into it, and they say, well, okay, this is the deal. We got these kids, and then we've got rooms that won't hold them all. So we can either not enroll them, which is financially crazy, or we can figure out some hybrid explanation for why we've got 2,000 kids in a class that only seats 500.
Right. There's a gentleman here in accounting, and the name escapes me right now, but from what I understand, he's doing this. And I just remember this because I saw a presentation about 2.5 years ago from him when I was upstairs. And it's someone that April Millay had worked with from an instructional design standpoint. So maybe we should get in touch with him to bring to one of our meetings.
Interesting.
Because what he had done, from what I remember, is allow students to opt into essentially showing up or not to class, and they have lecture capture installed in the rooms he's in. But he also allocated for, you didn't lock yourself into a modality when you signed up. So you signed up, you picked whether you wanted to show up or do, online.
Right.
And then he accounted for, like, you can go back and forth. And that's what he found, is a lot of students would go, they'd come a couple times and be like, well, I know some of this already, I'm just not going to come anymore. And then other students would choose the opposite direction and just get lost out of the gate and come back into their room. But yeah, he'd be interesting to talk to. I just need to go out and dig that name up.
Yeah.
So we did this thing, Living Dead Week. I don't know if anybody told you about this idea. So Kyle Bowen brought this with him from Purdue, where Google has like their 30% thing, right?
Sure.
So it's one of those things that's hard to cook into your job 365 days a year, because there's
Sure.
always other stuff. So what Kyle did at Purdue and what we did here is that he would find a time of the year that's typically fairly quiet, fairly dead, and say, we're going to do a week-long thing. You pick it. It can't be something directly tied to your job. It has to be something a little outside your comfort zone, and it has to be something that can be done in a week. And then that Friday, we went up to the Nittany Lion Inn. Everybody had 5 minutes to present what they did and do a Q&A. So I don't know if you've met Zach Zidek over here. He works in the gaming comments. So he's built a lot of EconU and a lot of the games that Stubbs works on.
Okay.
So he did this brilliant thing where he started out talking about, Disney World, theme parks, and then ended with, why don't we start thinking about learning as more of the theme park mentality. And the thing about Disney is they make waiting in line interesting. They make after the ride interesting. He was talking about Test Track, which is, you get in these cars that go really fast around like a NASCAR track.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're waiting in line, they give you little kiosks where you design a car. So you can go in and kind of, do this three-dimensional kind of design of a vehicle.
Yeah.
You get on the ride, you do the ride, you come out, and then you get a readout of how your car would have performed on the track. So his idea was, how can you design a space like that? So we were talking about things like the Thomas Building, right? Where what if you had big displays out front where students had a designated place to enter, and then, you've seen people just sit around falling asleep on their cell phone for the 15 minutes before they go into a room. So what if you could engage students in that space somehow, have them go into the classroom, and then there was a designated exit that kind of had another space designed intentionally for kind of informal things, stuff like that.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, it was probably, for me, the most interesting thing I heard that day in terms of presentations, because I was at Disney with the family, and Disney's just a great designed experience.
Yeah, and they do think about it in an extraordinarily comprehensive way, right? I mean, Disney thinks about, how you get your meals, how you get from place to place, how, every aspect, like what are your lines of sight from various locations in the park. And I think that's an interesting idea. We tend not to think about, I think we tend to think about, at best, university stuff in terms of programs, but often even just in terms of classes. Like, this is my class, I teach my class. So we don't think about how my class fits into the university in some systematic way like that. Like, on some level, we aren't trying to create that experience. Except maybe, perhaps, in sports, which I think is really interesting. Though it's not quite as intentional. Like, if you look at a football game, there's a constructed culture around that whole thing, right? You've got the tailgating that starts, and that's well supported, and they've got it all very systematic. So you get your parking spot, and they have the garbage bags out there, so you can take care of your stuff. And then when you go in, there's it's all very. They don't do the entertaining you while you're in line stuff, or like what's the exit, but there is more of a sense that it's not just the 3.5 hours that you're watching the football game. There's all this other stuff that goes on around.
Provide like a canvas of sorts that,
Right,
you have a lot of options to do things pre and post.
Yeah. But I think that's a really interesting idea to think about. And it also then gets to, taking it back to spaces, like how do we design spaces for that, right? In the same way that it was Zach, right?
Yep.
Yeah, in the same way Zach was talking about, like what is the design, what is the purpose of the space outside the classroom? It's not just a place where they come into, it's a place that prepares them to go into the classroom.